Right, folks, we'll get started in a couple minutes. I'm happy to see so many of you back. All right, it's just after 7, so let's get going. Welcome back. I'm very happy to see everyone. I hope that you had a nice sort of, I suppose it was university half term last week, and this time it's half term for the kids in London, and then who knows, next week it's going to be half term for some other sort of set of kids. It's very difficult to get sort of half term sorted, I feel, but that's all right. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about medieval piety. And that's something I know when I sent the email out, you know, when you say medieval piety, amusingly enough, the question that I got last night at the in-person class, the first and only question I got was, oh, are we going to talk about self-flagellation? They asked. No. And oftentimes, you know, we see something, you know, we have a sort of character of medieval piety in our head that's either the monks from Monty Python and the Holy Grail hitting themselves in the heads with boards, or we see, you know, it is something sort of boring and dull, you know, sort of, you know, benighted, starving savages sort of shivering in a cold church. And I am here to tell you that medieval piety and religious expression was anything but that. The most important thing that I want you to take away from all of this is that the Middle Ages were colorful. So whenever you watch a medieval movie, everything is entirely in gray and in brown, and the actual medieval people would not have recognized that at all. They loved bright, garish things. They loved lavish display. This was a technicolor society and a technicolor religion. If they could have it bright and garish and gilded, then they did. But there's a reason why medieval people loved color and display. So remember back to our first session when I said that medieval people sort of inhabited a very rich world of symbolism. Everything, almost everything had a sort of deeper meaning, sort of theological or symbolic as well as actual meaning. And they brought that symbolism into their exterior world, as well as engaging it with their interior world and in writing. So compared to medieval people, I would argue that we have an atrophied sacred imagination. We live in it's a 2D thing. There's no sort of depth to our world in the way that they had it. You know, space and place conveyed to them a sacred message. It had a meaning and a purpose in a way that it very often doesn't for us now. Medieval people were alive to the meaning and purpose of their sacred spaces and of their actions and their everyday sort of living in a way that the modern church oftentimes is not. And it's important to note, and this is a huge contrast from the way that many of us live now, is that medieval religion was a physical as well as a spiritual thing. Not only physical in the sense of space and place, but physical in the sense of action. So in the sense of good works. And works have often been portrayed in a negative light, with apologies to any of our more reformed brethren who are on this call, especially reformed writers in the 16th and 17th centuries assumed that works were not only a substitute for faith, but they claimed that good works were even an impediment to faith, because people did things to quote unquote buy their way into heaven, which means that they felt that they didn't need to have faith. Nothing could be further from the reality of the Middle Ages. That is not the sort of reformed thinking on works, is not how the medieval mind conceived good works at all. And I would argue it's definitely not how Jesus conceived good works either. If you read Matthew 25, when Jesus says to perform the corporal works of mercy, feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, visit the people in prison, etc. Was Jesus advising us to buy our way into heaven by doing good works? No, obviously not. Jesus portrays them, and the epistles portray good works as acts to which your faith will prompt you. So there's an underlying faith, and that faith prompts you to do good things in the world. So this is why St. James says, faith without works is dead. Now, it's important when we're talking about good works to think about what actually they meant by that. Good works are not merely nice stuff that you do for people. In medieval theology, because anyone, sort of Christian, Saracen, atheist, anybody can do sort of nice stuff for people. Does not rise to the level of a definition of a good work. Good works are the fruits of faith and love. So faith and charity, Thomas Aquinas would argue, are infused into us by God, and then the good works that you do are an outworking of your faith and love. So there are a consequence and outworking of the faith and the love and the charity in which God has infused into you. Okay, so sorry for theological sidebar, but it's really important to get our definitions right here. And to say that in essence, when we're talking about medieval pious expression, we are talking fundamentally about an integrated physical and spiritual expression of love. So keep that in your mind as we talk about all of this. And I just want to acknowledge that this seems really odd to us now. And it is one of those gaps between us and the Middle Ages that we really have to work in order to bridge. The sort of mind-body dichotomy, which is what philosophers would call it, is a lot older than the Middle Ages. I mean, it goes back to the writings of Plato, where, Plato has Socrates, essentially. Plato uses Socrates as a sock puppet. Socrates actually didn't write anything down. Plato wrote stuff that Socrates was supposed to have said. So Plato, using Socrates as a sock puppet, basically puts forward a sort of twofold view of mankind, that man is spirit and body, essentially a living ghost animating a dead carcass. So this is the ghost in the machine sort of theory of human nature. I would say that this is not the mainstream Christian view, though sometimes it's been co-opted as a popular view. And there is, of course, a sort of Neoplatonist streak. Somebody I know will bring up, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite. Cool, I get that. There's a Neoplatonist sort of school of Christian philosophy, but it certainly wasn't the mainstream, at least in the Middle Ages. Medieval people, as we've talked about in the first session, sort of saw love as a very high calling. It's the ultimate combination of spirit, of intellect, and of physicality. So this is not a non-intellectual, this is not a purely emotional love. Obviously, for them, intellect has to be engaged in love. Otherwise, you couldn't perceive virtue in your beloved. But love is not just intellect. It's not just an intellectual pursuit. It's also a carnal one. So in the sense of physical love, i.e. marriage, but also in corporal works of mercy. So the idea was, since we are not beings of pure intellect, if our love doesn't somehow find expression in the physical realm, meaning in deeds as well as in thoughts, then something is lacking in both our love of other creatures and in our love of God. And this is a constant theme that Thomas returns to, for example. So when you think about the corporal works of mercy, for example, they're physical expressions of your love of God, because of course your neighbor to or for whom you are doing these good works is made in the image and likeness of God. So anything that you do to your neighbor, fundamentally you're doing to God as well. And this has, as everyone on this call will realize, an excellent sort of warrant in Scripture. So this fell out of fashion, this sort of idea of an integrated intellect, physicality, and soul largely fell out of fashion after the Reformation. The Puritans that came in, they went back to this sort of, Platonic view of humanity, essentially sort of cutting our bodies off from our souls. And I would argue that that's more or less where we still are now, though for different reasons. A lot of people will have a sort of idea of their spirituality, their spiritual life, which is, kept in a sort of beautiful box and brought out once a week on Sunday, and then very carefully put back in after the church service. And then, they're doing other stuff, they're volunteering at a food bank, they're doing whatever, but that's somehow not integrated into their spirituality, into their love of God. So they're doing good works, but they're not necessarily the fruits of the faith. It's a weird sort of cut off type of dualistic type thing we got going on in the church, but that's, for another day. But why I bring this up is just to point out that when we try to conceive of piety in the Middle Ages, we really have to work to overcome the gap between how we understand and express our faith and how they understood and express theirs. They would say, we're bodies, we have these things, we're sort of gloriously corporeal, and medieval faith was gloriously material and corporeal. All right, so let's dive in, and this was wonderful doing this in an actual medieval church last night. I'm going to have to show you some photos, courtesy of my dear friend, Canon Jeremy Hazelock. So we're going to do this, and I am going to share this with you and hope that you're able to see this. Okay, so we're going to take a whirlwind tour, essentially, through a medieval parish church. I want to show you some of the gloriously corporeal stuff they did inside, and then I'll talk to you about some of the stuff that they did outside. All right, let's see, next. All right, so ground plan of a medieval parish church. It's cruciform. At the east end, there's a chancel with an altar. At the west end, there's a nave, usually has some side aisles and a font. There's going to be a porch somewhere that will allow you into this church. And then there's probably one or more chapels in various different side aisles. So we're going to take a look at the altar first. Now, this is a medieval illumination, and this is a very sort of English altar setup. You will see a nice altar. It's got side curtains, and it's got, there's a little hanging pyx above it. So let's talk about what's going on here with this altar. And obviously for them, it's Lent. Okay, so the east end, you have a high altar, you have the curtains, which are called riddle curtains, and you have a hanging pyx where the sacrament is reserved in that. The hanging pyx, usually it is veiled. So you have a bunch of different sort of ones. Here's a nice sort of reproduction. This is a triple crown one. It's got a sort of beautiful veil. Inside that, you'll often have the pyx, so the thing that holds the reserved blessed sacrament, in the form of a dove. So in the form of the Spirit of God that's holding this sacrament. So note that even though this thing is veiled, it is itself beautiful. Time and effort and attention is lavished onto this thing that very few people ever get to see. And that's an extant one. I love the sort of, that beautiful enamel and silver dove that's going on. It's a beautiful thing. That's hanging above the altar somewhere. You'll see the altar here. You're looking sort of through the rood screen at the altar. You have a lot of extant medieval churches that are hanging around in Norfolk for various historical reasons. Wherever you're sort of outside of the major cities and you have a high sort of recusant Catholic population, you tend to get more medieval survivals. But I'm not just going to show you Norfolk churches. This is a particularly beautiful surviving example. So if you were in, this was the 1500s and you were looking through, just before the Reformation, this is what you would see, essentially. Although the church has been whitewashed, it probably in the Middle Ages would have been painted, but that's another story for another day. So here is what it would have looked like in actual use. This is a high mass. You can see the three sort of sacred ministers, and there are a couple of acolytes that are looking, very nice in their apparelled albs. So it's a beautiful thing. This is essentially, you can still see the mass being celebrated this way in England, and it's a beautiful thing. Okay, so that's the high altar. That's the east end of the church. We're going to go and take a look at this thing that we were looking through at the altar just a moment ago. We're going to talk about the rood screen. Okay, so what's a rood? It's a crucifix, essentially. This rood screen has sort of lost its rood at some point. You will see that it is very brightly painted. Obviously, sort of, 500 years dulls the paint, but at this point, in the Middle Ages, it would have been very brightly painted, almost sort of garish in its painting. People sort of lavished time and effort and attention on this, leaving money to the church in order to endow it so that it could be painted and maintained and improved and have things added to it. You can see that this particular church also has two little side altars, one on either side. So here is a much better example of how something like this probably would have looked actually during the Middle Ages. You can see the wall paintings, you can see the really bright rood screen. When these things were made, they would have been screaming out at you in color. And medieval people really liked it that way. Here's another one. This one is actually in France. It's in northern France, Brittany. And this has been sort of kept up. This is a 16th century rood screen. And you're going to find something like this in just about every parish church in England in the Middle Ages. All right, and here's a very nice one that is in Suffolk that's restored. The rood screen itself was done circa 1480. It was restored in 1925. You can see all the sort of beautiful gilding and whatnot. And you're looking through the rood screen into the chancel at the high altar there. Okay, so when you talk about rood screens, there's always this sort of idea that, the poor benighted laity were sat behind the rood screen and, they couldn't see anything at the altar at all. And, they had no sort of participation in the mass and no way to sort of understand what was going on at all, because it was all in Latin, right? Well, not quite. I mean, especially in the late Middle Ages, although also in the earlier Middle Ages, you have a big sort of movement for expository preaching in the vernacular. So you start getting a lot of collections of sample sermons, with the idea that parish priests who were sort of unable, didn't have the biblical literacy or the sort of spiritual know-how to put together a decent sermon, could read one of these vernacular sermons out in order to teach the parishioners that they had in their keeping. So there always was, even if, yes, quite a lot of the Mass, or if not most of it, was in a language that the laity didn't necessarily speak, there was vernacular preaching. And of course, the church itself is a didactic, is a teaching tool. And this is why you have so many paintings and stained glass and things like that, because it's a didactic tool, and you're trying to get people to engage with the scriptures, even if they can't or won't read a Bible. And we'll talk next time the sort of idea that most people were not sort of literate in the Middle Ages, and absolutely nobody could read except sort of one parish priest. It's the later you go in the Middle Ages, the more that is absolutely not the case. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And I can't see the chat at the moment, so if you're saying something, I hope you can wait till later. Okay, above the rood, you have a sort of beautiful painted ceiling. Here, this one, for example, has a Christogram and a Marian emblem. Okay, so moving on. Now, we're going to talk about chapels very briefly. So, guilds and confraternities. Now, we right now, some churches will have an altar guild or flower arranging guild or whatnot. Yes, medieval churches had those, but when we talk about guild chapels, we're talking about, for example, arts and crafts guilds, essentially guilds of craftsmen, goldsmiths or fishmongers or whatever, who would get together not only to regulate their trade, but they would get together to worship. And there was corporate worship inside these sort of these trades bodies, for example. Normally, you would have guilds contributing to erecting a chapel in a local parish church or cathedral. Here's a beautiful guild chapel in a Norfolk parish church. You would also have confraternities, which they're not trade guilds, but they are, I guess, in a way, special interest groups. So you would have, confraternity of hospitallers, for example. So people who donated to the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, and they would get an indulgence for contributing money, and they would also get together to worship and to support that group. So it's a lot of lay interest groups, not only related to trades, but also related to other sort of interests that are getting together to endow these chapels where they can hear Mass, where they can have their souls and the souls of their loved ones prayed for. So that's guild chapel. You also have chantry chapels. So these are things that are privately endowed. Someone will leave money in their will, for example, to have masses said for the good of their soul, or for the good of the souls of their loved ones. And this was not sort of specifically to get them out of purgatory. I mean, that's one of those sort of things that you hear kind of tossed off. But remember back to our first session where we're talking about sort of all time being simultaneous. So in a way, I mean, yes, a priest is saying a Mass for the soul of someone who's dead, but if all time is simultaneous, then the prayer is also effective while they're alive, even though it's being said after they're dead. which is a bit of a sort of mind-bending thing, the more you think about it. So chantries, I would say, let's get together and endow a chantry now, but unfortunately, it is still illegal in canon law to dedicate or to endow a new chantry chapel. That's a pub quiz question for you. You have a lot of different sort of chantry chapels. Some are, they have stone screens, some with wood, but they're always sort of very beautiful. And people will often leave money in their wills to be buried in a particular chapel. Okay, and these chapels were being built, being endowed sort of as late as, you say, oh, well, 1530s, that's into Tudor times, that's into the Reformation. Nope, these things get endowed sort of very late in the game, as it were, as well. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the pulpit, and then we'll come out of this church. So the pulpit, I always, as a clergyman, I would be very worried about sort of standing up in these sort of very slim goblet style pulpits. You will see that they also are very richly painted and gilded with images of saints. And of course, the saints in little sort of banners are talking to you, which I think is very cute. There we go. And normally, you'll have the saint with his attributes, and the saint will sort of, tell you who he is and say something to you if you can read. Pews are a very late development. So, but beforehand, most people would have been standing up, as they are in Orthodox churches to this day. So pews are a very late development. And oftentimes you will have them sort of carved very elaborately, either, with saints or with animals, or with sort of some sort of didactic message, essentially, be godly, look at this pew end. Okay, so it's a very nice church. And then of course you have stained glass for didactic, for teaching purposes. Here are the corporal acts of mercy. So here is clothing the naked, and here is visiting those who are imprisoned, and you're giving alms to the people who are imprisoned. You have little beetles standing behind them, which I think is cute. So the idea is, you are not just putting stained glass in churches. You're not just putting, carving. You're not just putting paintings. You're not just doing stuff because it's beautiful, although it's also beautiful. But everything that you're putting in has a symbolic and moral and didactic purpose, in addition to just being glorious. This sort of idea that, well, the place that we worship in, well, it's all just fluff. It doesn't sort of do anything to enhance our worship at all. That's complete nonsense, as anyone from the Middle Ages would have told you. There's a reason why they want to worship in a beautiful place, because you're bringing down onto this earth some sort of slice of the glory of heaven and the New Jerusalem, and you're teaching the people who can't read while you're at it. So as I said, it's not just paintings on rood screens and stained glass. Usually, the walls are covered in some sort of paintings as well. Here is a really beautiful, I think it's this is, so you have Herod here. So this is essentially, you have the story of St. John the Baptist being beheaded by Herod, and you have, Salome sort of doing a nice dance, etc., and the poor chap being beheaded, and there he is in the middle with his head on a plate. There we go. There's Mary being crowned Queen of Heaven. These things are really beautiful. All right, let's talk about the font. Here's a really early one, and this is usually somewhere near the door of the church, the door into the church, because of course baptism is your way into the Christian faith, or into the body of Christ. So here's quite an early one. Here is one a little bit later, And then you have, by the late Middle Ages, you get to these sort of amazing things where you have, the 7 sacraments being carved into the fonts. This is sort of 14th, early 15th century. Okay. Isn't it lovely? All right. And then you enter the church via the porch. And this also, everything in and about the church is highly decorated and made as beautiful as it possibly can be. So here is sort of one in all of its glory. So here are all of the elements that we talked about sort of being put together. You have your chapels, you have your painted everything, you have your beautifully carved font, you have your pews, you have, there you go, a medieval church, a medieval parish church, and indeed a medieval cathedral is kind of an assault on the senses. At least we would consider so now. But it's a beautiful thing, and you're sort of, you're being invited into this jewel box that is a microcosm of the glory that you hope to share hereafter. Okay, so that's about half our time gone, and we have talked about, okay, so here is the physical expression of medieval piety within the church. So let's talk now about the spiritual expression of piety. So all of that sort of glory, all of that sort of lavished time and effort and interest in order to make something a beautiful space to the greater glory of God. Where did that all come out of? Because surely it can't just be we want nice stuff, so therefore we're going to sort of build ourselves a church. It had to be rooted in some kind of spirituality. So let's talk about that. We tend, as I said in the first session, to distance ourselves from the Middle Ages and treat, their writings and their lives as a kind of curiosity. So something to be held at a distance and examined dispassionately. But as I argued in the first session, that sort of historical distance is a fallacy. The sort of idea that you can box off the Middle Ages, that they don't have anything to say to you now, is complete nonsense. Medieval people, the authors, are speaking now, and they're speaking to you. And I would say, that they can still move you and entertain you and comfort you and bless you and help you and annoy the crap out of you now in our moment, if you will actually allow them to do that, if you will allow them to speak to you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to talk about only one of the things that I put in our suggested reading. We'll turn to another one of them, Piers Plowman, next week. But right now, we're going to talk about the Pearl poem. And this is a poem, I think it is one of the most beautiful things ever produced in the English language, and very few people know that it exists. So imagine yourself, it's the middle of August, which means the beginning of harvest. And a man goes to visit the grave of his little daughter, his 2-year-old daughter, who has recently died. He goes just to be with her, to sit with her in that place where she's buried. And he falls asleep on her grave mound. He starts to dream. And in his dream, he is also standing in a beautiful green place. It's got a river running through it, and there are crystal hills on either side. He looks around him, and there's a river. He decides that he's going to follow it. Something makes him want to follow this river. But the further and further he goes along it, trying to find a ford, trying to find a place to cross over to the beautiful thing that he sees in the distance, he's running. He starts running because he thinks that on the other side might be his daughter. He might have found where she is. But as he goes along this river and his grief grows and his desperation to see his daughter again grows, the river gets more and more dangerous. it speeds up, it becomes more and more difficult to cross. And the poem is amazing because he uses the meter. He uses the meter of the poem to show you that the dream figure, this character that he's inhabiting, is running along the river. And I'll read you just a little excerpt in Middle English because it doesn't work in modern English. So if you're going to get the meter, I have to read it to you in the original. So he says, Mora and yet well merra, me liste to see the brook beyonde, for if it was fairer then I confera, well luve locher was the fira londe. About the mecona y stota and stara, to finde forth the faster coni fonda, but wathers mo iwis edar wara, the fira y stocki by the stronda, and ever me thought I should not wonder, for whether I well so we no wara. Then I knew a note me common honda, that mevid me mean more and more. It is actually English. It's 14th century English from about the 1360s. So basically what he says is the further that he searches along the riverbank, the more danger he encounters, but he longs to see her more and more. He keeps saying more and more, I long to see my daughter. But then in the last two lines, then I know enote me common honda, he stops. He stops because he sees a crystal cliff and a little girl standing at the bottom of it. What strikes him? He sees this beautiful maiden, a young and courteous maiden. She's clad in spotless white with a girdle of precious pearls, and on her breast is the pearl of great price. His daughter was named Margaret, but her nickname, of course, was Pearl. He sees this girl standing and he says, O perla, quoth he, in perlas piety, art thou my perla that I have planed, regretted by me none a night. So, O pearl, says I, arrayed in pearls, are you my pearl that I have mourned for and grieved alone at night? I have concealed much longing for you since you slipped away from me into the grass. Sorrowful and wasted, I am overcome by pain. What fate has brought my jewel hither and caused me this sorrow and great deprivation? Since we were severed and parted from each other, I have been a joyless jeweler. And she replies to him, it is his daughter. And she says, but why have you been mourning me? If you are indeed a jeweler, if you indeed valued me this much, should you not be joyful that I am located in so beautiful a casket? And of course, is a play on words because of course it's the casket that she's buried in, but it's also a treasure chest in which she now is, this sort of beautiful garden of paradise that she's now living in. He doesn't quite understand. And he says, well, I'm going to come and live with you now. And she says, but you can't. You have to ask the prince of this place, and he might not give you leave. They park that for a moment. He doesn't understand, and he asks her the question that's been tormenting him since his daughter died. Where are you and how are you? What is your estate in life or in death now that I don't see you anymore? And she says that the Lamb has taken her as his bride. The dreamer objects. He says, well, that can't be. You are too young to have come to the bliss of heaven through your own works. How is it? How is it that the Lamb will take you as his bride? You can't have replaced Mary. And she says, no one can replace Mary. She's the empress of heaven. She is the queen of courtesy. But by her courtesy, she has allowed other maidens to be taken as brides to the Lamb. There are, of course, 144,000 of them, as it says in Revelation. Pearl tries to explain to the dreamer exactly how it is that she can have come to heaven. And what she does is she explains it by means of explaining the parable of the workers in the vineyard by Matthew 20. And she says, are you angry because I have gotten my penny for my day's labor without having had to go all the way through life? She keeps repeating, the grace of God is great enough to have brought her to heaven. His generosity is great. Those who at any time in their lives submitted to him, who rescues sinners, from them no bliss will be withheld. So that everyone who has done the will of God receives the same reward, which is union with him, final union with him by whom they were created. They sort of trade information, that they're quoting Psalms at each other. He's sort of desperately trying to understand how this can be. He wants to know that this is real. He wants to know that his daughter is at peace, at rest, in bliss, in heaven. She ends up telling him this sort of parable of the earthly and the heavenly Jerusalem. He says, well, show me that it's true, then show me the heavenly Jerusalem. And she says, well, I can't unless the prince of this place gives you leave, gives you a dispensation. And the prince does. So they're on opposite banks of the river, but they walk in parallel with the river between them towards the heavenly Jerusalem. He stops. The dreamer stops, and while he's gazing on a procession of the blessed, he sees the lamb standing as though slain. But he says, the lamb whose glances were gloriously happy, though his wounds was apparent. He's standing as if slain, but he's gloriously happy and shining with light, as in the revelation of St. John the Divine. This overwhelmed the dreamer. He says, this vision overwhelmed my human mind, and in desperation, he jumps into the river. He wants to be with his daughter. He wants to be with the lamb. He wants to be in that bliss. And so he jumps into the river. I mean, he feels, I think, would any parent, medieval, modern, otherwise would, if the price of being with my daughter again is to die, then I'm going to die. That's fine. So be it. Let me die so that I can be with her again. But the dreamer does not belong to the heavenly Jerusalem, at least not yet. And it's not permitted to force one's way across the river. So he jumps into the river, and before he reaches the other shore, he awakes out of the dream. Okay, so who wrote the Pearl poem? And the answer is that we simply do not know. J.R.R. Tolkien, who was for once working at the correct end of the Middle Ages, said of the poet, he was a man of serious and devout mind, though not without humor. He had an interest in theology and some knowledge of it, though an amateur knowledge perhaps, rather than professional. He had Latin and French and was well enough read in French books, both romantic and instructive. But his home was in the West Midlands of England, so much his language shows, and his meter and his scenery. Can I just say, incidentally, Tolkien wrote this at a time when academic writing could itself be beautiful without attracting suspicion. You can't do that now, sadly. So the writer, we don't know who he is, was not a priest. And yet he's very familiar with certain books of the Bible, with Matthew, with Revelation, with the Psalms especially. And he is able to put into the mouth of the Pearl Maiden, so the analog for his departed infant daughter, this long and beautiful excursus on the Gospels and on Revelation, and to give us in the closing lines of this poem a sort of meditation on the goodness of God as shown in the sacrament of the altar. So he ends, and I'll read this in modern English. He says, to please the prince or be reconciled to him is very easy to the good Christian, for I have found him both day and night a God, a Lord, an entirely perfect friend. I received this chance lying prostrate for sorrow for my pearl, which I afterwards committed to God, with mine own blessing and the precious blessing of Christ, whom the priest shows us every day in the form of bread and wine. May he grant us all to be humble servants and precious pearls to his pleasure. Amen. Amen. So what struck me, as it might perhaps strike you, I returned to this poem, last year after not having read it for quite a long time, is that the poem is a sort of microcosm of the grieving process. It depicts the first sort of stages of wild grief. He's bereft, he's searching everywhere, he can't get any rest. It depicts those first stages of wild grief, and it might even hint at his suicide attempts, or at least his sort of suicidal ideation. So it depicts those first wild stages of grief for the death of his daughter, though it could not possibly have been written during that first stage of grief. So the perspective that allows this poet, allows him to distill his grief into poetry, like the Pearl Maiden's sanctification, it's a gift from God. And his understanding of scripture, and indeed the love that drove him to that grief in the first place, is a gift of God. So that brings us back to love. So as we've seen, the medievals believe that love that is merely an intellectual abstraction, so something that's only in your own head without being given expression in the world, whether that is in the beautification of a church or whether that is in producing and distributing, literature, sort of meditations, without being given expression in the world, love is sterile and dead. We're far more than rude mechanicals, but we do have bodies. And so our intellect has to come down out of its high, cold tower and somehow consort with humanity. All right. So there's medieval piety, and there's love, and let's talk about that a bit more. Just as a preview, next week, we'll return to politics, and it's the politics of heresy this time. So I'm going to tell you about a group of Oxford dons who started a war that nearly broke Europe, and I am going to argue to you that the Lollards never existed. Them's fighting words. The Lollards never existed. So come back next week, this time. All right, so let's go through the questions. Type some in the chat. Okay, Martin says, does it matter if people are doing good works, why they are undertaking such works? Yes. So the idea is, if you are not undertaking them to the greater glory of God, then in a way it doesn't count. It's not a good work. It doesn't sanctify you unless you're specifically doing it to the greater glory of God. We're saying that's what the Sanctus spell is for, to announce that something very important is happening. Yes, so this is why we still ring bells at the elevation of the host and the chalice, because if you're sitting behind a rood screen, you at least know that the host and the chalice are being elevated. Although if you take a look in the photos of the parish churches that I show you, even if you're sat behind the rood screen, normally you could still see the altar, sort of decently well. Now, obviously, if you're in a massive cathedral like Norwich or like, Westminster Abbey or whatever, no, you're not going to see it. But if, most people are not going to church in a place like that. And Gordon also says the chantry priest was quite often not the parish priest, and that's very true. So there were a number of sort of stipendiary chantries and whatnot. People would leave money in their wills to endow a sort of, basically a stipend for a special priest that he would keep the chantry chapel, and that would be his thing, and that would occur, or he would be there in addition to the parish priest. Okay, so Roger says, in what ways was the didactic purpose of stained glass achieved when the panels were so far away from the viewer? Well, this again depends on sort of what the configuration of the church is that we're talking about. So some of the glass that we're talking about, you know, is sort of in side aisle, sort of low enough down that you can see it. Now you do have other things that are sort of, in a way, they're sort of not quite meant to be seen. Like anyone who's ever been to the Sainte Chapelle, for example, you know, you're sort of craning up your neck at these sort of beautiful things. You have a sort of window that tells you the story of Joshua, which is intimately tied into Louis IX sort of, you know, crusade, but, you know, that's another lecture for another day. It's interesting because you can do a survey of sort of, you know, what stories tend to be sort of lower to the ground so that you can see them versus, you know, sort of more figural things higher up. I'm not sure if anyone's actually done that kind of survey, but that I think would be fascinating. Yes, Gordon says, given the general perception of illiteracy in the Middle Ages, why are there so many personal books of hours in existence? Precisely, my friend. So, you know, why would you have a book of hours? So essentially a book that shows you how to say the offices, you know, those who say morning and evening prayer, a book of hours, literally the liturgical hours. They were used. So if you ever go and visit any of these manuscripts, for example, in the British Library, you can see that many of them are in fact very well thumbed. And you will see that, you know, that the gilding is missing or the paint is missing in, for example, depictions of the Man of Sorrows. You'll see that the ink gets a little blurry around his feet, so that people were obviously kissing these things and using them as devotional images. Books of hours actually really were used. And one of the books that I put in the suggested reading by Eamon Duffy basically tells about how English people used books of hours. So these books for their daily devotions. And I commend that to you if that's something that you are interested in. And we will also, when we come to talk about Lollardy and heresy next week, we are going to talk about, you know, people's engagement with the scripture, with religious material, with or without, you know, being able to read. And I will send you out, I'll be cheeky and send you out an article from the English Historical Review, it was published only 2 or 3 months ago. And it's basically sort of rethinking of how many people actually could read in the later Middle Ages. Let's see. Okay, Martin says, re your answer about undertaking good works. I understand that to be the case in the Middle Ages. Is that still the view of the church or indeed any of the denominations? Okay, so in the Church of England, go back and read your 39 articles. You can take them either way, essentially, and I think they were meant to be taken either way. The Roman Catholic Church, I believe, still subscribes to a sort of more medieval view of works as being, number one, necessary to salvation, but number two, as sort of arising from or being an outworking of your faith and charity. And Anita says, do you think the Pearl poem author was part of the contemplative tradition at that time? Now, this is quite interesting. So he would have been quite early in that contemplative tradition because, you know, Pearl was written round about the 1360s. And when we're talking about the English contemplative tradition, you have a wonderful sort of flowering or blossoming of contemplative writing that begins in England, say around about the 1380s. I mean, you have people like Julian of Norwich, for example, and I've put her Revelations of Divine Love in your suggested reading. And if you haven't read Mother Julian, then I suggest you do. It might be, a nice sort of Lent devotion for somebody. If you've never read Mother Julian, give that a go. I would say he would be quite early. I think you could make an argument. That there's something in the air, something in the water in England, in the sort of 40 years after the Black Death sort of recedes, that you might sort of put him in that tradition. So yeah. So while we're talking about, I suppose, the contemplative or the mystical tradition, we've talked about Mother Julian, right? The other end of that sort of contemplative tradition, in sort of time period, I also commend to you Walter Hilton's Mixed Life. Now, Walter Hilton was sort of about maybe 120 years or so after Mother Julian. And Mixed Life, formerly called An Epistle on the Mixed Life, basically he's writing to essentially middle class people who want to understand how to integrate their spirituality into their everyday lives, given that they have a job, they have a household to run, they have responsibilities. And Walter Hilton, who also wrote The Scale of Perfection, which some of you might know, that is more for, it's not necessarily just for, say closeted religious folks, but it is definitely for sort of more people who have a lot more time to devote to prayer. And Mixed Life is literally the sort of via media between being a contemplative, enclosed religious and being a complete sort of heathen. So if you want to know how the medievals integrated their spirituality, when they had a job and a household to run, I commend Walter Hilton to you. He's still useful after 500 years. And David said, and I think in the interest of time, this will be the last question, how widespread was the practice of pilgrimage in this period, and where were the typical destinations? Now, that's an excellent question and a very fascinating question. There's this sort of idea that the vast majority of people never went, more than a mile from where they were born. I don't think that you can make that argument sensibly anymore. Pilgrimage was incredibly popular, both as a sort of physical undertaking. You get on a donkey, you go to Canterbury. There were a lot of people who did that, but also sort of pilgrimages of the spirit. So those who, got on a donkey and went to Canterbury would bring back sort of tat for their friends and neighbors who couldn't go with them. And the idea was that you would sort of join your intentions with them while they were on their pilgrimage, and you would reap the spiritual benefit of the pilgrimage that your neighbor went on. So I would say that just about everybody went on pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. Not all of them went physically, because not all of them could afford to go, obviously. Canterbury and Walsingham were the two major ones, but you also have Chichester. People are going down to see St. Richard. You have Ely within England. Pilgrimages abroad were also fantastically popular. So you get quite a lot of travel licenses for people going to Santiago de Compostela. That's probably the most popular destination for English people that's not in England. So they'd go to the Shrine of St. James at Santiago de Compostela. They would go to Rome. There are quite a lot of travel licenses for people to go to Rome, and people would indeed go to Jerusalem. And there are quite a lot of English people throughout the Middle Ages who made the very long and arduous journey to Jerusalem. How do we know? We know because basically we have the Lonely Planet guides from the Middle Ages. People were going on pilgrimage and writing, okay, here was my itinerary in Cologne, see this guy, it's nice to stay here. We had problems in this sort of area. And you have people who are writing these pilgrimage guides. They're among the first things that get printed off of Caxton's press. The first thing actually was a Crusades indulgence, but that's another lecture for another time. Pilgrimage guides are fantastically popular. The first extant one that we have is from the 4th century. It's a Spanish nun called Egeria, who went to the Holy Land and wrote a pilgrimage guide for her sisters back at the convent so that they could sort of, spiritually engage with her pilgrimage. And we have pilgrimage guides from, the Tudor times. Purchase His Pilgrims is probably my favorite one of these. It's hilarious, basically. And we have pilgrimage guides from, every sort of era, every year in between. So, and yes, many pilgrimages, they were fairly local. Not everybody had a lot of money to go to Canterbury. But the good thing was, because there was this sort of idea of spiritual participation in pilgrimage, you had quite a number of people who were able to sort of raise money to go on pilgrimage. And they basically said, look, contribute financially towards my pilgrimage. And when I'm at the shrine of St. Richard, the shrine of Thomas a Becket, the shrine of whatever, then I will pray for your intentions, if you will sort of, give me a shilling for the mule to get there. Okay, so I think it being 8 o'clock now, I think I'm going to sign off. Thank you all very much. Yeah, medieval crowdfunding. It was a thing. All right, so come back next time for Lollards or not Lollards, and for some lovely shenanigans at Oxford. See you next week. Bye-bye.